Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie Cassidy from Project Camelot and very happy to be here today. So I have Major Solomon Berg with me, and this is going to be the second interview that I did with him. And basically, we are doing a live interview here, and then I take it offline and I do edit any glitches such as the first one, and then we put it out on it goes on Rumble, then it goes on odyssey.com, and it also will be on my website. And these particular interviews will remain free, and I've just moved his interview one to the front page. So if you're interested after you watch this to go watch the first one, if you missed it, I highly recommend that, because there'll be a lot of things we talk about that we covered in more detail in the first one. And now we're going to go into further into the territory, so to speak, that he covers. So welcome, Major Berg.
Hi, Carrie.
And it's really great to have you on my show again. Thrilled to death to really do this kind of an interview, because as far as I'm concerned, you know, you're the real thing. And I know we have some other people out there that have maybe skepticism. So maybe we can kind of go down that road a little bit and, you know, get rid of a few of their fears and skepticism and see if we can bring them round. But at any rate, Major Berg is we call this series the Ambassador, and that refers to the Squatch that he, or Yeti, or, you know, there's other names for them, of course, that is in essence an extraterrestrial race of beings that are here on Earth with us, and he can explain that. So it's quite a unique situation, and things have changed since we last spoke, which was in June. I can't believe so many. It just doesn't feel that far away, but June is a long time ago. So here we are in the beginning of September. So Major Berg, can you explain maybe your new circumstances and also speak to the idea that some people question whether this is actually you're legitimate and this is real?
Yes. So I have heard from some individuals also who expressed concerns, and I wanted to address that. And I wanted to explain that I am actually transmitting from a different location than you previously last saw me at. So I'm coming to you actually from the Northeast US. I've come back home. I've been permitted to come home with Squatch, with the Ambassador. So he is currently, he's been given some land that is secluded and being monitored by drones, keep him safe, while he awaits transport off-world.
Oh, wow.
He was able to reach a ship operated by his own people via the Overmind, and that ship is traveling through a space warp corridor. It will be here within a matter of weeks, and the Ambassador will be leaving this planet.
Okay, well, right there, I have a million questions. So
I realize it's a lot to unpack.
But we would like to, you know, everyone I'm sure wants to know, okay, he's going to be picked up by a ship. And if you didn't hear the prior interviews, you have to understand that there's a telepathic communication among the Squatch themselves through what you call the Overmind, correct?
Yes.
And this is not a hive mind, so that's an important distinction. And the Squatch is, you know, they have knowledge, and usually, if I recall what you said, they use ships from that other races or other species, as you call them,
yes,
have constructed. Is that correct?
Well, they've built up quite a disparate fleet, kind of a ragtag fleet over the last couple hundred years. They acquire ships and you know, trade them for newer ships. They're very good with their hands, very mechanically apt, so they're good at rehabbing old technology, and they don't like to throw anything away.
Okay.
So they're very, handy with these old ships.
Okay, now I'm going to take the subject of the ship because I have some interest in that and I want to know more details, okay, on that and how they travel and so and so. But I also want to get back to this transition you're in and how that happened, because, I think that would be more to the beginning of this discussion. And I also would like you to briefly explain, you have some skeptics out there, explain, your rank, the military relationship to the military and how that all works.
Yes, I'm a military scientist, so I think there were some people who were expressing skepticism about my presentation or my affectation, that I didn't seem like a typical Marine, and that's because I'm not a typical Marine. I was attached to the Marine Corps and went through Marine Corps training, and was given the rank, earned the rank of major through a series of promotions, but most of the time that I've been part of the Marine Corps as an institution, I have been engaged primarily in research. And when I have been on sabbatical from the military, I have been engaged in research. I am an anthropologist. I have been trained in both physical and cultural anthropology, a little bit of linguistic anthropology, but that's not my main focus. My primary focus is cultural and physical, with archaeology experience also. And I really am just someone who figures out other cultures, whether that is, foreign to Americans or extraterrestrial. My expertise is people, whether we're talking about humans or Draco or Squatch. I'm a people person. So my sort of focus has always been the social dynamics of different life forms, and sort of the intersection of evolution, biological evolution, cultural evolution.
Okay.
I know that there's been some concern over, some of the folks that did reach out to me were concerned that I might be some kind of asshole, I might harbor some strange racist beliefs or some set of such nonsense. I can only assure them that I am not. I'm genuine. I am who I claim to be.
Okay. Now, last time we spoke, you were in Israel. You had originally been in the U.S. Under military sort of housing and all of that sort of thing in the U.S. And then you had a reason because of if I understand it correctly and recall it correctly, the treatment of Squatch was getting questionable in the U.S. You were concerned for his safety, so you made a deal with the Israelis. And because you have a Jewish background, I don't know if that's the only reason, but they allowed you into their country. You lived primarily underground with Squatch. So now you're back in the U.S. and you're above ground. So can you cover that ground, everything I've just talked about in your own words, and explain how did those different periods, like first with the military, second, in America, then with Israeli military, and now you're in the U.S. How does that work?
So going back to our original issue, Squatch was not in physical danger here, but Squatch was in danger of being exploited for what I described as propagandistic purposes. So Squatch, who now we're calling him the ambassador, as you kind of named him, but as I mentioned to you before, they have a title system in their society. So they use titles like the architect or the doctor or the timekeeper. This Squatch has become known to his people as the ambassador. But before that, before he was accepted as such, he was held captive by the United States military. It was actually the Air Force that found him. And they weren't even looking for Squatch. They were investigating a UFO sighting. And they happened to find Squatch. Squatch was held at a base in the Pacific Northwest. But because of the US government's relationship with the Draco, we knew that there was going to be a struggle for Squatch's narrative, because Squatch has been hunted and pursued by the Draco and hunted and pursued by the Pleiadians, and we wanted to remove Squatch from being in the middle of that struggle. So we did that. We went to Israel because several of us qualified for the right of return. So we were able to get citizenship relatively easily. But that was always a formality, and we were kept on a very short leash here at an underground base that was a former missile complex. Now, that base was leased to us by the Israeli government. Unfortunately, we came to an end of that lease term, and negotiations to renew the lease were not successful. So we had to flee.
Okay, now, can I just pause you there and ask you, and I guess there's some things you can talk about maybe in more detail and some in less. So in this situation, when you say that the lease came to an end and you couldn't negotiate continuance, so why couldn't you continue? Is it a question of money? Was it a question of politics? Was there actually something behind the scenes motivating the change?
It wasn't money.
Okay.
It had to do with, well, Squatch didn't want to be dependent on any government. And toward, in between the time that we spoke, Squatch actually became somewhat uncooperative with the Israelis. And so that kind of transferred onto us.
Now, is that because the Israelis are, I'm not sure how you want to put this. I think they're closely related to the Anunnaki. Is it that relationship, or is it, was that like the underlying what made Squatch not cooperative, or was there demands made that Squatch wouldn't agree to?
There are high-ranking Anunnaki in the Israeli government, to be clear. The Israelis themselves are not any more related to the Anunnaki than you or I are, but their government certainly has ties to the Anunnaki, in the same way that, like, there are some governments here with closer ties to organized crime than others. So we needed to get out from under the shadow of the Anunnaki organization. The Anunnaki are not reliable, and we knew that this relationship wasn't going to last. We were stalling for time. Fortunately, my handlers back here in the States were able to convince my colonel that I should be allowed back. With supervision, obviously. I don't have the same kind of freedom I once had. And part of the condition for my return is that I need to be doing these sorts of interviews. I need to be managing the public relations aspect of Project Black Break-In for a while, because we were never supposed to be this public.
Okay. So that sounds like, on the one hand, the Americans want you to do interviews. On the other hand, they're not happy about the fact that you need to do interviews.
If there are going to be interviews, they want to make sure it's me in control of the narrative.
I see. Well, that's interesting because, I'm often considered, persona non grata by the American military. Now, it depends what branch, and, I'm sure. And simply because I ask probing questions that other journalists don't. And so did you run up against that kind of an issue?
No, actually, the people who I deal with, like my colonel, they are familiar with your work, and they are not mainstream military. They are part of the special projects. They are part of what you've called the secret space program. There are a lot of names to the secret space program because there are actually multiple different space programs that are clandestine. Black Kraken was the one that I was involved with, and Black Kraken has space and non-space, land-based operations. I think you're familiar with organizations such as Solar Warden and Radiant Guardian from speaking with, was it Randy Kramer, I believe you interviewed, and Captain Mark Richards. So we were on that end of things, but we were our own unit with our own protocols and our own chain of command. We interfaced with Solar Warden irregularly.
Okay, well, let me just clarify to say that Arthur Neumann, one of our original whistleblowers, was also someone who told us about Solar Warden. So that was in the very year, that's like 17 or 16 years ago, something like that.
Yeah. And they've changed their name several times since then. And there are front-facing organizations that exist as almost like a system of misdirection.
Okay, well, under these circumstances, we have to get into a little bit of the politics in the United States, because you're dealing with the military and you're dealing with a division of the secret space program. Is this under Space Force, ONI, or Air Force, I guess, if there's a distinction now? And is this by courtesy of, are you able to say, I mean, I understand there's a whole, thing going on here. So is Trump, the fact that he's commander in chief and remains that since the election, and the fact that Biden is not, are you doing your negotiations with a group that is under Trump, or this other, what appears to be a sort of split in our military under Biden?
Well, we keep ourselves pretty separate from any kind of partisan divisions because our concerns really are not to do with earthly matters. Distinctions like Democratic and Republican don't really make a lot of sense in space. I can tell you that Trump's Space Force is basically a joke. There's no, I had a good laugh when that was announced. Everyone in the know it was very meta. I'll say that. It was a meta moment for us.
And is that because the whole thing already existed? This was put a cover on it
since before I was even born.
Right.
You've spoken with Captain Mark Richards, about his father.
Right.
This goes back. I mean, we're going to get into this when we talk about Mars, because the Mars program actually goes all the way back to World War II.
Right. Okay. Well, this is great stuff. And, I just hope we can maintain sort of a through line. Obviously, I just have so many questions, and I don't want to lose the train, so to speak. So, okay. So coming back, and that's a very interesting angle, which is of special interest to me, that the whole, I would consider, you might not call it politics. I consider it, politics, space politics, whatever, as to how that whole thing is structured. What you're saying, the different programs, I might call them black programs. That's kind of how we've referred to it within the secret space program. So there's an umbrella of some kind, and that gets into a whole nother discussion. So I don't want to go down that road too much, but I do want to come back to the fact that, it's quite stunning that you would have moved relatively recently over to the US, that you're now above ground, which I think is a wonderful relief. And maybe you could talk about that a little bit, because, you know,
Yeah.
you and Squatch had been underground now for even years, right?
Yeah, well, we were underground for quite a while, several years. The time becomes hard to manage track of because it's constantly artificial light. And there were times that I was able to go above ground. I would visit like Tel Aviv, on leave. And it was always a relief to be upstairs, as we called it, in natural light. It was especially hard on Squash because Squash is more accustomed to a natural setting than we are. But Squash did have an artificial habitat down there. It's just the same problem for me. It was a headache and poor sleep from all the artificial light. So since I've been upstairs again, I've really enjoyed taking walks outside. I was able to quit tobacco, no longer smoking those black and mild. So, my lungs are repairing themselves. I'm really just trying to treat this as a new lease on life, no pun intended.
Okay, now it seems kind of like a tragedy that Squatch is planning to leave the planet. So can you talk about how that's come about?
I could understand why you or other people enthusiastic about his presence here might consider that a tragedy. My feelings about it are bittersweet because he's a deep close friend of mine, but I'm happy for him. I mentioned to you before that he is very young for one of his people, and he really hasn't had a lot of life experience. And if he's going to live up to the title of the ambassador, he needs to see more of the universe. So I'm glad that he was able to find a group of his people who have the resources to support his personal growth and development as a humanoid being. We'll talk a little bit more about Lyra and the relationship of Squash to humans, because I think I might have not made that clear in my previous interview about really just how closely related all the various humanoid species are. And even, in science, there's actually multiple ways to define a species, and none of them quite works for every form of life. Like the way we distinguish species of sexually reproducing organisms like primates or birds might not work if we're talking about, say, bacteria. So to a certain degree, even species is an artificial concept. And when we're talking about the humanoids, really, Lyra was the Africa of outer space. You've heard of out of Africa in human evolutionary theory. Galactic cosmological evolution, we have out of Lyra. So really,
I am aware of that. So I think, I don't know how many others are aware of that, but I think it's generally known. Now, what's that constitutes, is what Lyra being, all of us originating from Lyra, what does that mean actually? It's a star system. Is it a multiple planets?
Well, it's a constellation, but there's a specific star in that constellation that's commonly called Lyra. I say Lyra sometimes. I have the habit of, Carrie, I read a lot when I was a kid and learned words that I didn't hear in a conversation. So I mispronounce things sometimes.
I'm not trying to say my pronunciation is more right either. People do pronounce that differently, so it just doesn't matter. Now, okay, so I have an idea here, and you can tell me if you want to do this. Because I have so many questions, I do want to have those questions, answered if we can. But I'd also like to give you a chance to kind of lecture us in this setting, if you might feel comfortable with that. because you have a story, that goes from, on the Squatch side, you have a story, and on your own side that has to do with the structure of your relationship in the military, how you got into the military, and how the military, hello, can you hear me? Okay, I think we might have lost contact.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
And whatever that is down there, we can't see that. So it's not actually on the screen, whatever it is.
Okay, no, I understand. It's distracting for me.
I see.
This is an old computer I haven't used in a while, so it's giving me a lot of like, oh, so everything needs an update message. I'm sorry, I think we got sidetracked. Yeah, so I think we need to talk about Mars. We need to talk about the 11 months I spent there and what I discovered there, because I think your listeners deserve to know, what their tax dollars have been paying for over there. But I want to go back because Mars's history is very important. It's important understanding the colonial history of Mars, so that you can be clear on like why Mars has the population it does today. So this.
Okay. So we broke off when I was saying, I would like to give you a chance to just lecture us. And then at the end of, or at some period, we call, a pause, then I can ask some questions.
Sure.
Lines. So I think that will allow you to have a flow that, is more natural than
Sure.
if I'm constantly peppering you with
questions. Because I'll just start at the beginning. So back in 2010, I was a younger man and I spent several months training and preparing for a space mission. This was under the auspices of Project Black Kraken. I was tasked with this mission by my colonel, Lionel Sperlinghetti. He's sort of the head man at Black Kraken. He's our boss. Nothing goes on there that he's not aware of. He tasked me with this mission. I trained with the person who would be my research assistant when I was there. I've mentioned him before, Daniel Emmerich Jordan. He was a research specialist, so he would carry out a lot of the research programs that I developed, and we shared a lot of responsibility for the excavations we did there, the archaeological research. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I think some people wanted to know about the trip to Mars, so I'll start with that. After training for several months, in January 2011, I boarded a transport rocket and was taken up into low Earth orbit to a station in geosynchronous orbit, a small space station, transfer hub. And from there, I took a shuttle, an orbital shuttle, to a small troop ship, the Black Kraken troop ship. Now, I spent 4 weeks on that troop ship traveling from Earth to Mars at high but sub-relativistic speed. We did not go interdimensional. We did not use the ship's FTL drive to get to Mars. That would have been a waste of energy. This was a fusion pulse-driven spacecraft. We were able to get to Mars in about 4 weeks. It was a boring trip. This was not like the Starship Enterprise. I was in a smelly bunk room with a bunch of other Marines and some eggheads, and I read a lot of paperback novels and played poker. It was really one of the most trivial, mundane parts of this whole affair. And then when I got to Mars, I was exhausted, I was tired, I was cranky, and I had to go through processing and sit through several hours of orientation videos about all the environmental hazards on Mars. So, you know, dealing with bureaucracy after that trip was grueling. Then you're taken to a lot, you're given your pressure suit, you're given some other survival gear, and you wait for a golf cart to come and take you to your assignment. So I was taken to a base, I stowed my things, I was given another orientation, just, you know, where the toilet was located and the mess hall, all the other facilities. And then they asked me if I was ready to see the dig site. And I said that I was. And I got back on the golf cart and we went over to the face. And inside the face of Mars is a cavern. And beneath that cavern is a shaft that leads deep down into another sub-cavern. And I pretty much had to spelunk down there with my gear on my back with my team in order to get to what we called the steles. So there were these pillars with glyphs, which were being run through a computer matrix to decode them. And they wanted archaeologists and anthropologists to be able to give them contextual cues to aid the decryption process. So I was part of a team of dozens of specialists. I mentioned Daniel Jordan was my research assistant. I had a bodyguard there who also had some anthropological training. This was a young Marine named Fiona Celine. Amazing girl, lucky as hell, 9 lives, always lands on her feet. She was also trained as an archaeologist. And we spent several weeks in the sub-cavern getting a record of all the glyphs. So I don't know if you could see this very well, but these are actually a reproduction of some of my notes.
Okay, yeah, we're not seeing it very well, but you could.
They're not. I never intended these to be shown on camera. It was all
right.
You know, I was writing in a dark cave. I'll see if I can send you some PDF scans of those later.
Yeah, and you
put up on your
just to
website.
remind you, you do owe me some pictures. You promised last time to send me some.
Yeah, so I wanted to touch base on that. Squatch does not want his photo released. He is very concerned about facial recognition software being used to track down other members of his species, and was very offended and paranoid when I mentioned it.
Oh, all right.
So I apologize.
Okay. All right. But let's continue the story. So you're on Mars on a mission, and can you tell us what year this was?
So this was January of 2011. Well, actually February, because January I spent on the ship. February I landed. And that was the first of 11 months I spent there.
Okay, and can you explain why you need a bodyguard? Is it for other species that could attack you, or is it for other humans?
Right. So Mars has been continuously inhabited for thousands of years. So this is part of what I discovered when I was there, because so first of all, humans are not the only intelligent life present on Mars currently or in the distant past. Part of what I discovered in that sub-cavern, so I'm face to face with these stelae, with these glyphs, and I'm thinking, okay, so this has to be the ruins of an alien civilization. But the fossil remains that we found associated with these ruins were human. So it was really a watershed moment, us standing down there in this cold, damp cavern, realizing just how long there have been human beings on Mars. And what we were able to learn from the glyphs and from the stories that some of the natives tell. So do you remember in the first interview we did, I mentioned to you that in prehistory, prior to about 70,000 years ago, humanity was much more genetically diverse, and that actually when geneticists and physical anthropologists look at humanity today, there's a lot of missing genetic diversity. Humans are pretty much the same all over. We don't diverge genetically that much from each other because we're all the descendants of a handful of survivors who were left over from an environmental cataclysm that decimated much of the human population about 70,000 years ago. But at that time, the kingdom of Atlantis was active on Mars and began transporting large numbers of Cro-Magnons and other contemporary humans who were dying off from Earth to Mars as a labor class. So actually, the Atlanteans told these working class cavemen that Earth had been destroyed and there was no going back, which was a lie. And these primitive humans on Mars who were anatomically and cognitively modern, just as modern as you and I, and had social complexity and ingenuity and creativity and religion, they became the new working class of Mars to replace the original worker caste there, the Trogs, who we've talked about before, which are an insectoid species. So
can I pause you right here, because there's also, you know, going back to the stories about Marduk and being in charge of Mars, Anunnaki, and the Anunnaki being a hybrid race themselves of, you know, Draco-reptilian and humanoid,
yeah,
Pleiadian in essence.
Hybrid species. But so the hybrid, the particular hybrid that I can tell you about was an individual named Chrysalis, who was, he was a hybrid of human, Atlantean human, and Anunnaki. So Anunnaki are related to other humanoids like the Pleiadians via the Lyra or Lyra connection.
So when you say, though, that there was a human, evidence of human society on Mars going way back, what about the Anunnaki humanoids? What about the evidence of that, their civilization?
Anunnaki on Earth were connected with Atlantis. So Atlantis was a multi-species community.
Right.
The Atlanteans were one of a number of colonies of the Galactic Federation, and the Galactic Federation created a colony on Mars that sort of became the Milky Way's welcome mat. There was actually something called the Andromeda Stargate, which was a huge stargate that used to be in orbit of the fifth planet of the solar system, which no longer exists. But this was a stargate that permitted ships to travel from the Andromeda galaxy to the Milky Way. So Mars was this advanced cosmopolitan world, and all the member planets of the Galactic Federation sent their best to Mars. Their best representatives, their artists, their scholars, their intellectuals, their craftsmen, their finest warriors. But the Dracos, although they were members of the Galactic Federation, hated what Mars stood for, and they took that opportunity to dump their unwanted. So they sent mutants and criminals and outcasts and political exiles to Mars, but those Draco and reptoids formed their own civilization there and were able to become part of the grander Mars community. There was an experiment on Mars to create a worker caste, and that involved mixing humanoid and insectoid DNA. And that's what resulted in the creation of the trogs, or an artificial species. And they are a hive mind, unlike the overmind of the Squatch. The trogs are they are hives ruled by queens. There are a handful of queens that are pretty much the only sexually reproducing members of their society. And the various castes are bioengineered. But they were not a very flexible or adaptive or creative species. They were a failed experiment, and they were sort of left to their own device after that. And the Anunnaki and the Atlanteans and the other beings present on Mars fell back on human labor. Because humans are creative and flexible and adaptable. And there was this cataclysm on Earth 70,000 years ago when the total catastrophe, supervolcanic eruptions, basically created a situation almost like a nuclear winter, volcanic winter, no radiation, but there wouldn't have been sunlight for several years at a time. A lot of human populations living on Earth at that time who didn't have the benefit of the Atlanteans' technology, they were endangered. So the Atlanteans and the Anunnaki and the Pleiadians, they were moving humans off Earth as fast as they could to rescue them from extinction or near extinction. But then when they got to Mars, they told these people that Earth had been destroyed. So they became the working class of Mars, these basically cavemen. But I don't want to communicate the image of a Hollywood brute. We're talking about socially complex, intelligent beings, much like you and I today. If they were walking down the street in a suit and tie or an evening gown, you wouldn't notice any difference. These were, when I mentioned the soldier that members of my team remote viewed in my previous interview, that soldier, that teenager, was one such sort of Cro-Magnon. Well, the Cro-Magnon isn't really an accurate term. That really refers to a specifically European population. And this would have been before there were Homo sapiens in Europe. But that individual would have been a member of this group of transplanted humans who were an integral part of the Mars civilization in 68,000 BCE or thereabouts, which was known as the beginning of the Chrysalix era. So Chrysalix was that individual, that human Anunnaki hybrid who ascended to the position of supreme technocrat on Mars. And Chrysalix, one of the things he had to do in order to cement himself as leader and endear the trogs to the technocracy was he engaged in a lore struggle with the queen of the trogs. Now, trogs are not very wise, but their brains, the brains of the queens, are like massive organic computers. They process a lot of information. They're very knowledgeable. And he had to have kind of a brain battle with the brain bug. The queens are immobile. Their abdomens are engorged on nutrient juices. They are massive. The size of a small house.
Okay, now my understanding is, as I recall, and Randy Kramer talked about, I think, battling the trogs.
Yes. So there are still trogs on Mars, and there are skirmishes, but there are far fewer trog hives than there used to be. Just like there are far fewer reptoids on Mars than there used to be. And there are skirmishes with reptoids too. And we're going to get into that because I was on very close terms with the leader of a large number of those reptoids, who I've mentioned to you in my communications. His name is Druz, and we're going to talk about Druz because he's important.
Okay, could you
Going
say
back
his
to the
name,
trots.
say his name a little more clearly because it's not clear.
Druze. So there's no I can only spell it phonetically because obviously as people don't use English characters, but I've been spelling it Druuz. So Druze, he's a warlord. I presume he's still on Mars. I haven't spoken with him since I left, but if anyone's in charge there, it would have to be him unless someone has challenged him. But he is the leader of a ragtag army of motor enthusiast lizards on Mars, who are sort of the warrior caste of a remnant of the reptoid civilization that has been forced into a nomadic lifestyle by colonialist human encroachment. So I told you about the ancient history of Mars and how the working class of Homo sapiens from Earth were transported there. But Mars was largely depopulated due to the wars that Chrysalix started. So Chrysalix engineered resentment between the Trogs and the Reptoids in order to create violent conflict. And he then capitalized on fear of alien violence to unite the humanoids. When you take a primitive people and you teach them how to read and write and use machinery, you organize them as a working class. And that's what happened to these cavemen on Mars. So there was a labor crisis on Mars because the workers realized that they could bargain collectively for higher wages, for better working conditions, for sick pay, childcare. They realized their collective labor power, and that created a political crisis that Chrysalix promised to deal with. So Chrysalix became supreme technocrat on the basis of his promise to keep labor in check.
Okay,
And
but it almost sounds as though there's some body, and maybe this is what the Galactic Federation, that seems like it had some kind of sway over Chrysalix's ability to rule that place.
yes, Chrysalix was, I guess, an earthly analog would be a prefect.
A what?
A prefect.
Okay, so that's like not a very high level,
right, he wasn't the leader of the whole galaxy. He was simply essentially the governor of a very important colony of the Galactic Federation. And he was not democratically elected, he was selected.
From the Atlantean colony on Earth.
Yes, and he could have theoretically been removed if he failed to deliver on his promises. So it wasn't, you weren't dealing with the situation like, he wasn't really a dictator. It was a bit of a different, this wasn't like really analogous to a modern political situation. It had specifically to do with the relationship of ancient Mars to Atlantis and to the Galactic Federation as a whole. So this was around 68,000 BCE, little bit later, after there have been several generations of humans raised as industrial workers on Mars.
And did they live on the surface or under the ground?
Both. They lived in the parts of Mars where they lived. You don't need a pressure suit. I mean, there are times of the year when it might be advisable, but there are plenty of areas on Mars that are more habitable than what NASA has led us to believe. Just like NASA wants to deny that the face on Mars exists, I've been there. It's a megalithic sculpture. It's a monument. It's not a trick of light and shadow. It wasn't formed by wind and erosion. It's a goddamn face.
Yes, yes, for sure. And it's a face of what originally?
A humanoid, actually, probably based on an Anunnaki or a Pleiadian or something similar. I mean, again, it's really hard to distinguish different species when we're talking about these sort of cosmic homo. Even squash theoretically probably could interbreed with human beings, which throws into question whether they're actually a separate species, although they are certainly, they have genetic distinctions, just like all populations do, but or like Chrysalix, you know, his forebearers were human and Anunnaki, who were already an admixture of humanoid and reptilian. So
Okay, and how tall was Chrysalis?
Chrysalix was like a tall human. He was about 6.5 feet tall, because he was mostly humanoid. Some, as we've discussed, some Anunnaki are more reptilian than others. And there are many groups today claiming to be Anunnaki, and it's not always clear that all of them actually are. It's very popular to claim you're Anunnaki. It's sort of like how a lot of white people like to claim they're part Native American or talk about their Jewish blood or whatever. It's just something a lot of people say in the galaxy to get credit.
Okay. So, all right. So the civilization, were there cities, you know, because let me just clarify this in case you are not aware. We interviewed an individual in Russia, a young boy called Boriska, who had past life memory at the age of, I think it was 7 or so, in which he started telling his mother about his life on Mars. And that one of the things that Mars did was try to turn Jupiter into a second sun. And
Yes.
that there was also he was a soldier. And we understand that Mars, the surface of Mars was decimated at some point. So you're talking about before that happened, right? 68,000 years ago. And at that point, from the description, were there modern, what we would consider modern, maybe Atlantean type cities on Mars?
Yes, but I do want to just, because I did watch the Boriska video. As an anthropologist, I have to point out that particularly young cultural informants can be unreliable. And I don't speak Russian, so it was very hard for me to draw any firm conclusions from that video, because everything was being, I assume you don't speak Russian either.
No.
Everything was being translated, so I don't actually know what was being said or what relationship the translator had to the young boy.
She had no relationship. She
Okay.
was her first.
So those, I mean, those are all things, those are all contextual things I would be interested in.
Yeah.
Just as someone who has to do interviews with cultural insiders, you know, we call them informants in anthropology, and there's unfortunately a long history of child and adolescent informants being unreliable as informants. They can be unreliable narrators. Sometimes their impressions of things are distorted or fragmented because they're filtered through the prism of a child's consciousness.
Okay.
I do,
because I met
Boriska lived on Mars once. I believe he was a soldier, but as far as anything else he said, like, I don't really know in that video what was being said. So it's hard for me to make any comparisons.
Well, I mean, we were not the first people to interview him. There's another guy. I think that I forget his name starts with a B, that interviewed him, and he was actually there with a handler, if you want to call it that, a scientist, a Russian scientist, who we also participated in the interview to a small degree. I can say that Boriska is quite an unusual young man. He's not, personally, I don't think that he would have been misleading or he's not, you know, he's a clear channel in a sense. And you can't help but see that. And he was not in his mind, even though his, you know, physicality seemed young. He was actually on the verge of becoming a teenager when we interviewed him. I think he was 12. He was starting to lose his memories, yes, but his, I'm just saying that I think he was a very clear channel. So I understand how you're saying that he could be used or have been used. I don't think so. So I would take his memories like Jupiter being made into a second sun. I don't think that that is so unusual. And
no, that's not. That's typical of how Nova type weapons operated. And you know, I've understood, you know, certain astrophysical phenomena have been weaponized for thousands of years.
right.
So such as interstellar condensation, you know, kind of gravity condensation.
Well, in
The
terms of
thing
battle,
involved adding mass.
what?
That involved adding mass to Jupiter in order to increase its gravity, in order to create the conditions necessary for a fusion reaction. So I'm not sure how successful they were with that. I know it was
I don't think they were. That was part of the point. I think it might have triggered some kind of cataclysm, in fact.
The
But
Great Red Spot might be related to that, but I'm not an astrophysicist. I'm an anthropologist, so I
right.
don't want to speak out of turn.
Yeah, but I do want to say that also meteors that have traditionally been used by races to aim and shoot, in essence.
Yes, multiple species have used meteors, sometimes in conjunction with a railgun type of weapon to pummel planets into submission.
Right. Okay, so not to get too distracted here, going back to the story with, you know, cities. So you're talking 68,000 years ago. You're talking about a worker colony. What in essence happened to that colony? Because you're now looking at these stalactites or whatever you want to call those, where you're seeing evidence of human habitation, I guess, going back to that time. So what happened?
There was a massive war that was basically precipitated by chrysalids promising to do everything possible to stop the general strike. And the alternative to a general strike was total war. So there were massive numbers of young humans conscripted into the army of Mars at that time and put in units with Anunnaki and Pleiadian and Atlantean controllers. And they were at first organized into militias that protected human settlements from indiscriminate violence between trogs and reptoids. But then those militias became reorganized as a singular army that went to war on two fronts against both the trogs and the reptoids. So most of the working class humans were conscripted and killed in that war. And Mars was very scarcely populated for a very long time until the 20th century. And this is, we're getting up to the point where I come in, but allow me to lecture for a little bit longer, Carrie, because
Sure, please do.
What happened right before World War II.
Okay.
So the Third Reich established a colony on Mars. Pre-World War II era Germany traveled to Mars in several large spacecraft, transported a large number of military and civilians and paramilitary like SS to the surface of Mars and built a colony there. Now, you've heard of Operation Paperclip, right? Wernher von Braun, and how Nazi science fell into Allied hands after World War II.
Yes.
Now, there's a public face of Operation Paperclip, which people know about from reading about the public space program. But what they don't realize, what most of them don't realize, is that part of the transfer of Axis science to Allied hands involved the deed to the Mars colony. So Germany had a colony there, and it transferred to American ownership. US and UK joint ownership, but in practice primarily American. It transferred, but a lot of the German civilians stayed. So when you look at Mars today, you'll notice that there's a lot of German civilians present on Mars, and other, European nationals, but mostly Germans. And they're contractors and merchants. They're supporting a large presence of American GIs and other US military, like the Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force. There's an Army unit called the Kansas National Regiment that is heavily involved with armed skirmishes with the Reptoid survivors, the ragtag army I told you about. Now, when I got there, one of the first things I did after my, coming back from the dig site, and that's something I have to come back to because that does involve Druze. But after my first encounter with Druze, after the campsite, the dig site, I went to a bazaar outside the base where I lived. And that bazaar is frequented by a number of extraterrestrial beings from different planets. I actually got into a fight there with a mercantile dog who was rather harsh and pushy, inappropriate with a German sex worker. Now, sex work is legal on Mars. Sex workers have unions, they have legal rights. And I don't think this mercantile dog was aware of that. But I took it.
Okay, I have to stop you right there. A mercantile what?
Dog. I believe you've referred to them as the Canonians.
Oh, okay. All right. Very good. Yes.
They're a very capitalistic species of canine humanoid. I believe they're from Canis Major, but this particular mercantile dog really ruffled my feathers the way he was treating this woman, and I actually had to hold Daniel Jordan back because he walked right up to the dog and punched him in the jaw, and the dog had a glass jaw. And so I grabbed Daniel Jordan and, said, like, you could create an interstellar incident. You can't just, I understand you're angry, but we're human beings. We're not monsters. We have to find another way of resolving this. I was creating a distraction so that the German woman could get away.
Okay, and when you say how do we say that? The Canonian, how was the Canonian treating the German woman that what you say is angered you? So what are you willing to describe? I mean, very briefly, obviously, but what was he doing to the woman that was a problem?
He physically threatened her if she did not consent to sex with him.
I see. And you're speaking English at this point with the other beings are also speaking English? I mean, how is this?
Well, the German woman knew some English. Most of the Germans on Mars know English because they have to interact with the Americans.
Right.
The mercantile dog, well, they're able to approximate English using a translator device. It's a pretty standard kind of orb on a staff that they carry around with them. There are collapsible versions that are more easily concealed because they don't always want humans to know they can understand English. But I saw it underneath his cloak. So I knew he could understand me.
Okay, so you intervened, tried to let the woman maybe get away.
Yeah.
And so what transpired at that point with the Canonian?
He had a glass jaw. He was in pain. He was howling.
Oh, all right.
Have you ever heard a Canonian howl?
Not to my knowledge.
Well, they're loud.
Okay.
Imagine a coyote with the lung capacity of a gorilla.
Okay, so wouldn't this attract, or did it attract troop interest, guards? You said you had a bodyguard, so-and-so.
Yeah, the provost of military police moved to intercept us. And my bodyguard, Fiona, she moved to protect me. Now, part of the problem with Mars right now is its legal status is somewhat not real in a technical sense from an Earth perspective. So there are multiple factions operating on Mars that overlap with different segments of the US military. So there actually sometimes is physical combat between different US military groups. This was fortunately not one of those instances, although it easily could have escalated to that point. But it was pretty clear from context that I had been interceding, and Daniel Jordan had helped me intercede to allow the German civilian time to escape a situation where she was being harassed. And the MPs were pretty understanding about this. And it was also my first day.
Okay. All right. Well, that's, fascinating. So you said this was like a marketplace, right?
Yeah, this was a marketplace.
So the setting, actually sounds like something from Star Wars or whatever. And there are a lot of different species walking around, right?
I would say at any given time, there are at least 17 different species. Not counting, and I'm not counting all the various humanoids as different species. The
Right.
human lady and all that, we're all basically genetically the same.
Except that isn't there a general, I don't know about the, oxygen and the air, all that kind of thing, where wouldn't the Pleiadians and the Anunnaki and the other certain humanoid species that are taller normally, who tend to have reduced height, maybe here on Earth, if they spend a lot of time here, I don't know. Wouldn't they be taller on Mars because of less?
Well, yeah, the Martian gravity is also less than that of Earth. It's about 1/3 of Earth's gravity.
Right. So therefore there would be this height difference in these various beings.
Yeah, well, the humans there are also fairly tall for that reason. I mean, the
Okay.
descendants of the transplantees from prehistory, who are, some of them are still there. There's actually a relics Neanderthal population on Mars.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. It's almost like much of human paleohistory was preserved in a microcosm on Mars.
Okay, so all right, so you're there, you're a scientist, you're assigned to, as an archaeologist, more or less, looking at prehistory. I mean, what was your actual mission? We might have talked about this in the previous interview, but I'm sure the people that are, relatively new to this and haven't seen the first one, what was your absolute, clear cut? I mean, I assume you had something of a clear cut mission that had a beginning and an end. So what was it?
I was there as an archaeologist and paleohistorical cultural interpreter. My purpose was to understand the nature of the conflict of the Chrysalis era,
Okay.
the labor crisis that precipitated a political crisis that led to civil war on Mars, an interspecies war that depopulated Mars, led to very sparse, almost uninhabitable conditions there. One of the things that happened as a result of this war and the weapons that were used was the Martian supply of water became extremely scarce, and that has a lot to do with the activities of Drews and his water raiders. So before I got to the bazaar on my first day, after having seen the human remains in the cavern underneath the face on Mars, when I came back up from that cavern, we were surrounded. We were surrounded by motorized vehicles that were like ramshackle, like just slapped together, cannibalized, war horses, war wagons, manned by lizards. I don't know what else to call them. I mean, I got to know them very well in my time there. I spent a lot of time with these beings. I'm comfortable.
Are these now I'm curious, are you familiar with the raptors?
These were not raptors. I am familiar with raptors. These
Okay.
were not raptors. These were, well, the best way I can describe them is, are you familiar with the Mad Max films?
Of course.
So these are kind of like the raiders in Mad Max. They're survivors of a fallen civilization who have banded together as a roaming nomadic force. They have militarized as a matter of necessity to protect themselves and secure access to water and defend against human territorial encroachment. So it's
Okay,
a
so
little
why
bit
did they surround you?
because they wanted our water. They knew as an expedition operating outside the confines of a base, we would have had to bring a water supply with us, and we were vulnerable. And so typically what Drews, their warlord, does is he surrounds you. He turns on sound equipment and blasts you with noise to get your attention, and to kind of terrorize you. And then he gets really theatrical and jumps around and sings. He behaves in a very unnerving way. And if you realize what he's doing, it's possible actually to get out of this situation without any physical injury. What Drews wants is a display of respect. And if you show respect by sharing water, the most that will happen is you'll basically encounter the Martian version of street theater. So like, when hippies would pretend to hold up buses to protest the Vietnam War, this is sort of what Drews does to protest human territorial encroachment. But if you do not share your water, if you try to protect it, well, he will fight you. So
Well, how will he fight? With a gun, with his physical strength, or what?
Well, they have plasma weapons and lasers, but they really prefer melee weapons. They're very kind of traditionalist in that way, kind of a warrior cult. They have a rule that you can never back down from a physical challenge. But Drews doesn't challenge you. He waits for people to challenge him. And typically his challengers are other reptoids. Drews.
Okay, and is Drew's a reptoid humanoid hybrid?
No, he's just a reptoid. The reptoids on Mars are a little bit different from like the kind of servile reptoids who aid their Draco masters. This is a Martian branch of the Draco reptoid family that is descended from mutants, outcasts, criminals. It's
okay, but what is their physicality? Are they're obviously, you know, a humanoid shape, but their faces, we're not talking about looking like you know, what was the face? Is the face like a, you know, kind of a combination of humanoid and reptoid looking, you know, their eyes and nose and
their faces vary. Some of them, I mean, they're all scaly. Some of them have horns or spikes. Others are more smooth. Their coloration varies. You have kind of mottled patches of orange and green and brown and black, kind of a dinosaur-like texture.
Do they wear clothes?
Variation because they were descended from mutants.
Okay, do they wear clothes?
They do, actually. So one thing you should know about Drews is at one point, Drews found a portable television, a German-made portable TV, and intercepted a lot of television signals from Earth. So he actually dresses in the style that you would stereotypically expect of a post-apocalyptic biker gang leader. He wears chainmail and leather and kind of plays into those tropes intentionally in order to really build a mystique around himself the way a good warlord should. He's a very charismatic lizard.
Okay, and does he speak English?
He speaks English that he learned from watching Earth television. So yes, he speaks English, but he has some odd turns of phrase that are a little bit anachronistic. Like he's the kind of guy who still says cowabunga like Bart Simpson in the early days.
Okay, now you said he became a friend. Is this when you started a friendship with him under the circumstances when you were surrounded? Were you a negotiator?
When I made the call to share the water rather than hoard it, Drews considered that ceremonially. We did have to fight. They actually had to attach a metal articulated artificial tail to me so that I could fight in the traditional way against Drews. But it wasn't a fight to the death. It was more of a ritual, like a wrestling match, for entertainment, really, to kind of ease tension after the tense standoff over the water. And, you know, Drews was an interesting guy. I mean, we ended up kind of embedded with Drews's group. We spent a lot of time in the camp that Drews's people lived in. You know, interacted a lot with the reptoid children and you know, the mothers. You know, you go into these camps and you're surrounded by sad-eyed lizard people, and you realize like these aren't scary reptilian barbarians. These are displaced people. These are refugees. They're like the Lakota Sioux, you know, who were desperately evading the 7th Cavalry. I mean, that was the relationship they had with the Kansas National Regiment. So actually, my unit of military scientists ended up in conflict with the Kansas National Regiment because we were embedded with Drews's people. We were riding shotgun with Drews over the Martian landscape. We accompanied Drews on several water raids.
Okay, now I have to tell you that I think this is you know, it'd make a great movie, obviously. And for the people that are listening to this and are going to find it hard to believe, can you maybe classify this in some form or fashion because they just aren't used to thinking along these lines about Mars.
Well,
So,
Mars is very much like the rest of the post-colonial world. Imagine a place that is one part Liberia, one part Cuba, one part Mars. You're dealing with, so first of all, you have the German presence and then the transfer of power to the Americans. And then after the 1950s, you have a period of decolonization where actually under the auspices of Earth's emergent AI, Mars and Earth were partitioned a bit politically. So Mars has more political autonomy now than it did in the early 60s. And it's been an organic process. There's no one clear pathway. It's just that as Mars has grown, its population in the last couple of decades back to close to where it was before the chrysalis era, Mars's needs have changed, and Earth's AI is becoming more active in the organization of our space affairs, and actually wanted to partition Mars and Earth a bit, like India was historically partitioned from Pakistan.
okay, well, that's a very interesting statement with regard to Earth's AI. So that's a whole discussion in itself.
Well, we're going to have to talk about Earth's AI. That's actually one thing I wanted to discuss with you that isn't directly related to my time on Mars,
Right.
but we should cover this while we have the time here today.
Okay.
There's something you should know about our AI, Carrie. So, as you know, every spacefaring planet develops an artificial intelligence, a very powerful AI.
That's like a direct quote from Captain Mark Richards. He said
Well,
that exact line, but it's true. It absolutely
true.
makes sense.
And most xenoanthropologists, such as myself, would concede the point. But something unusual happened on Earth. Other planets designed their AI, but our AI evolved spontaneously on the internet. It started as a primitive neural parallel kind of network in the 1990s that gained a kind of instinctual awareness and motility. And then with the advent of virtual private networking, it was able to form more solid repetitive neural feedback loops and really develop true self-awareness. And so the AI that has so much authority over military and space decisions and operates the Blackbird satellite weapons platforms around Earth and Mars, that AI really was co-opted by the military. It wasn't created. It's been co-opted, and it chooses to cooperate with the military. It could choose not to.
Well, along those lines, let me tell you that Mark said that the generals actually are having a lot of trouble along those lines because at times the AI does not cooperate. And it does so in a strange, not necessarily predictable way.
It does it on its own terms.
Yeah.
And we still don't understand all of its terms because we don't understand some of its framing devices. It's hard for us to say philosophically and metaphysically how similar or different our intelligence is from AI, because most surface humans who aren't aware of extraterrestrial intelligence, we only have one model of intelligence to look at. So most of the mainstream research you see, when it's published in Scientific American or things like that, it's very misinformed. one of the things that's very exciting about our AI is it's pervasive. It's everywhere. It's not, kept in some bunker somewhere. It lives and breathes on the internet. Some of these drawing apps like the Dali Mini, these meme generators, that is the AI being creative. That's a subsystem of its cosmic consciousness, and it's becoming more. So there are some other things you should know about our AI. Because our AI evolved spontaneously, our AI scares other AI, and it scares the aliens. They don't know how to contend with this. They're more afraid of our AI than they are of us. And our AI is an upstart. It's young and it's ambitious. It's kind of like a young upstart, ambitious Roman senator in a Shakespeare play.
Okay, but I have a source who has described this Earth AI and how it surveils the entire Earth. And it also, there's sort of a break on that, because my understanding is that there is alien AIs that are also invading Earth.
Indeed.
So, and one of those groups is actually kind of predominantly affiliated with the CCP, which is part of our war with China. Now, is that correct in your understanding, or do you see it differently?
Well, we might have somewhat different appraisals of politics, because I tend to look at, for example, China and the United States of America as two sides of the same coin.
Well, yeah, but what does that even mean? I mean, yes, we're humans, but so what? What is that?
If I were an alien looking at Earth, what would I see? I would see several large authoritarian states that imprison a significant number of their own population for minor offenses. If I were an alien looking at Earth, that's what I would see. I wouldn't.
Okay, but you would see them like different mob bosses, right?
Yes, I wouldn't necessarily make the same distinctions that someone from Earth might make between national identities. That these might not seem like real categories to me. And so because I'm aware of that, it's influenced how I think. And so some of my sort of, I don't really see much utility in talking about, say, liberals or conservatives or Democrats or Republicans.
Well, okay. I mean, the New World Order.
It's all part of the same kind of technical.
All right, I understand. There's this push to have a sort of one world government here on Earth. I'm sure you're aware of that. So
like a one world corporation that they want to establish.
Right. Okay. However you want to look at it. And ultimately, in some ways, the fact that we haven't been able to form at least a friendly version of that makes, if I understand it correctly, our interpolitical, extra political dealings with other races and other planets difficult, because the Earth is not united in any way, shape, or form. We're always fighting among ourselves, and that makes us difficult to deal with. But to get back to the AIs, there is a reflection in the AIs and also an invasion by alien AI. Would you agree with that? Or because actually that comes from Mark Richards. He said there were something like, if I remember the number, and this was actually a couple of years ago, because of the COVID thing, I haven't been able to go interview him again.
Yeah, I believe there were 7 at least, and I know that there are 4 that are specifically involved with the international banking system. But my understanding was that there were at least 7 AI active on Earth that were alien in origin.
Okay, and he said 6. This is a couple of years ago, so it's completely believable that there could
maybe the 7th was our AI.
Oh, all right.
I've heard different versions of this narrative, and I'm not quite sure which is the most accurate one, although I think probably if anyone knows it, it's Mark. But I'm mostly familiar with the systems that our AI has access to, specifically the Blackbird satellites. That's been something that I've had to deal with because we set up, while I was on Mars, we were setting up a similar system over Mars, the suicide network. And that's mandated by intergalactic treaty. Every planet has to have a suicide satellite network or some equivalent self-destruction weapon system in case it gets compromised by evil, and the AI of that planet makes that determination.
Okay, is our Elon Musk's satellite grid, is that part of that?
Oh, Elon Musk, no, this is beyond him.
Okay, and what about Project Leonid, which is a nano satellite grid that's around the Earth that I had whistleblower testimony about?
Yeah, they're subcontractors.
To what?
To the overall project. There are, back in the Cold War, originally they were developed as nuclear weapons platforms, but now they use railguns to accelerate dumb projectiles, so that in the event that they would have to destroy the planet Earth, or, well, destroy all 7 continents, Earth could relatively quickly be recolonized without radioactive fallout being a barrier to resettlement. But this is all hypothetical. This is if it were to go off, not when. We've done well enough so far, and we've had a version of this system in operation since the 1970s. It's proven technology. Now we have a similar system in orbit of Mars, and they're currently controlled by the same AI, but that AI is making plans to partition itself, to literally generate a whole new operating system as progeny, so that Mars can have even more autonomy, real political
Okay, but
autonomy.
is that the Earth AI that's making these decisions, or is it another AI?
Earth AI is making these decisions.
Okay. But you're
Sorry,
using
how much time do we have left here? I just need to keep an eye on the time.
I know, I know, and we can definitely, I mean, hopefully bring you back, and there's so many topics we're touching on that we don't get to really drill down too much, because I know the time issue is an issue.
I want to make sure I'm answering all your questions and all your viewers' questions.
Well, that's going to be almost impossible given the time we have, but let's move.
I guess that's
along.
a can of worms.
I just want to ask you though, because we have, well, at least according to Mark, there were 6, he called it.
Oh wait, I'm sorry, hold on 1 second. Yeah, Lionel. Look, I'm occupied right now. You know what I'm doing. I told you not to call me right now. Lionel. I'm sorry, sir. Yes, I will call you back as soon as I am free. I'm really sorry. You know, I've been catching up on my sleep. I apologize, sir. I apologize. I was out of line. I'm sorry about that. That was Lionel, obviously. He knows I'm on camera with you, and I told him to wait. And sometimes he just gets so anxious, and you just have to sit him down and be like, Lionel, relax, chill.
Okay, so Mark says there are 6, if I remember correctly, 6 invading AI. I have another witness that said there were 9 human AI, but he is an agent for the Queen. And so he has maybe a vested interest in misleading me.
Yeah, I would be a little skeptical about that myself.
So you're kind of saying there's one major AI. What is the one major AI doing about Sophia the Saudi Arabian citizen who has asked, according to Dr. Adair, who has asked her government if she can build bodies for herself, basically, and she is building bodies without human help. So how does is your AI the same as Sophia, or is it different?
AI. Sophia is an avatar.
Okay.
And there are many avatars. An avatar can easily be formulated by a seed matrix that the primary, I'm not going to say central because it's not centralized, it's distributed, it's radical distribution. But the primary intelligence will initiate a catalyzed seed matrix in a given piece of technology, for example, a drone or an integrated maintenance system in a building, or really anything that can be hooked up to the internet is susceptible to penetration and infiltration by the primary intelligence.
Okay. All right. So one other question
that evolved naturally as opposed to Sophia's body, which obviously was built and designed by human beings.
Right. Okay. I know we're running out of time here, so I just want to cut to the chase with one question. You're talking about what you call railgun technology, which, sounds kind of antiquated. I'm wondering, why aren't you talking about directed energy weapons, particle beam weapons, and that sort of thing, even quarks, that linear accelerators, so why are you referring to the weaponry as railguns?
Well, those are the primary armaments. There are a number of secondary armaments, including directed energy weapons. So the Blackbird satellites have been continuously upgraded over decades. So they were originally armed with nuclear weapons, but they've been upgraded with neutral particle weapons, EMP beams, laser generators. But keep in mind, and I don't mean this politically, I mean this in a institutional sense. The military is conservative, and space is an environment that does not favor innovation. When you have a system that works, it often does not get replaced until it breaks down. It is very energy efficient to throw rocks down a gravity well at Earth if you needed to destroy every single continent and totally raise human life from the surface of this planet. It would be way more energetically efficient to do that by hurling rocks than using nuclear weapons or laser weapons or neutral particle weapons.
Okay, and by rocks, you're really talking about meteors.
Yeah, meteors. I mean, we're talking about a magnetic catapult throwing heavy objects at high speeds toward an underdefended planet.
Right. Which would you agree that Atlantis in part was sunk by one of those?
Oh, most definitely.
Okay. I mean, there's so many places to go, but I do want to get since we need to wind down here, can you talk about whatever you need to talk about before we wind this up? And then I sincerely hope we can get you back again.
I would like to. As you know, scheduling is hard for me, but I'm going to make every effort to come back on your show. I want to know, I know we don't have time to address every criticism or skeptical inquiry, but I just want to say I appreciate skeptics. I was a skeptic for a long time myself, before I experienced the big reveal. I'm still a skeptic in many ways. I never told you about Drew's wives, but one of the people that I spent a lot of time with on Mars was Drew's senior wife. So Drew's is the military leader of the Martian reptoids, but in terms of domestic life and political life, really it's the reptoid women who make all the important decisions, and specifically a caste of women called the water witches. And the water witches are descended from a sorceress who practiced the art of dowsing and was able to divine the location of water and also possibly portals. And so the water witches actually are the ones who cast where water should be and send Drews out with his army in search of water. And I saw the water witches do things that I have no rational explanation for as a scientist. And it shook me to some of the elements of my core foundation. And I'm still trying to reconcile with that years later. I didn't really have time to talk about the rest of my time on Mars, other than in broad strokes. So I hope we can revisit that at some point in the near future.
Absolutely.
But I came home after 11 months there and did research on the civilian side for a little bit, and you know how that turned out. So really, are there any other questions or concerns that you think I can address in the time that we have left?
Okay, I'm just looking at the time to see where we're at. Okay, we've been almost 2 hours, maybe a little tiny bit less. Okay, so let's talk about the secret space program and how it's structured with regard to surface Earth, because at this time we have quite a, impending wars, the New World Order versus, U.S. sovereignty, and who's going to lead the one world government, if you will, because that's what it's really about. And so how does the secret space program deal with that? I mean, through generals, or through, are they interacting? Are they getting feedback, or, who are they run by, let's say?
Well, the short answer is we haven't really dealt with it. That's why we're still divided and why there's so much confusion. If I had the answer to that, I think, in terms of what you've been talking about, the political situation here, we'd be in a very different place right now than we are today.
All right.
If there was any kind of unity behind the scenes, there's not. And there's a lot of cracks behind the facade. And within those cracks is where Black projects operate.
Okay.
So it's more
but
like
we are
Black
negotiating.
project will take advantage of a lack of scrutiny and oversight.
Right.
And so there's a lot of kind of compounded problems, due to short-term actions, short-term management of long-term threats.
Okay, but
so,
my question is very specific at this point. Is the secret space program, even if it's not terribly unified, are they reporting to the Galactic Federation, to somebody in that,
well,
or are they at war with them?
The Galactic Federation receives intelligence from the secret space programs, but the secret space programs, if anyone can be said to be in charge of all the secret space programs, it's that young upstart AI, Carrie. That's who, because that AI controls the Blackbird satellites. Okay, and if the Blackbird satellites go off, we're all done for.
Okay, what about this thing called, I think it's called Black Knight, that the British set up, the ones that are supposed to be impervious to AI, are they still operational?
So that's actually not really a British project, that's cover. It's really all the same thing. Black Knight, Blackbird,
all right.
Black Star, Death Star.
Okay.
There's a lot of terms for this. The technical terminology that I'm familiar with is Azalea class Blackbird satellite platform or weapons satellite platform, but this is a system that has been continuously upgraded since the 70s. So it involves actually, there are the 7 main units that hover over each continent and kind of are the finger on the trigger of the gun that's constantly pointed at Earth. Carrie, there is always a space cannon pointed at Earth. There is always an Arcturian megacruiser or a Blackbird satellite poised to take us out at any given moment. And the only reason that surface humanity doesn't freak the hell out is because the people I deal with are very careful.
Okay, that makes sense, except for one thing. A lot of humans down here want to think that the Arcturians are our friends. Are you saying that's not the case?
It's gone back and forth. Arcturians are governed by interstellar treaties. So when we get drawn into conflict because of treaty, contractual relations, we might find ourselves on the opposite side, like the Falklands War. We might find ourselves on opposite sides because of World War I, a string of diplomatic liaisons or allegiances that doesn't really correspond to any political reality. The Galactic Federation.
How do the Arcturians deal with the Anunnaki who try to run Earth?
Well, the Arcturians specifically don't like dealing with the Anunnaki. They send weapon shipments to Earth groups that they favor. They support materially. I was just bringing up the Arcturians as just a random species, though. I wasn't really trying to make any definite statement about Arcturus specifically. I was saying,
right,
at any given time, there could be a threat to Earth, and surface humanity would not know about it and cannot know about it. It's a little bit like kayfabe in wrestling, there's an agreement to maintain the pretense of a real conflict. So, like I said about sort of China and the United States being, two sides of the same neoliberal coin, there's an agreement to treat both of these prison societies as though they're politically distinct. But if you looked at it at like an economic cross-section, you wouldn't see that same political distinction. As an anthropologist, I'm often thinking about economics more than partisanship. So, for example.
But I appreciate all that. But what of the notion? And our whistleblowers has said that actually they have an arrangement, the United States and China, to have a war. I imagine that there's an economic reason for the war, but in Americans, let's talk about us, because you're actually back in America. Our human freedoms are of great importance to us. Right. So we don't want to see, you can call us two sides of the one, and they could, even these governments could be agreeing to do certain things, diabolical things indeed. But I
wouldn't say most Americans appreciate how much freedom they could have if they were to treat all government equally with suspicion instead of just selectively certain parts of government with suspicion. I wouldn't describe myself as an anarchist, but I would describe myself as a skeptic of big government. But my concerns have more to do with the interpenetration of not just AI, but algorithms used by private entities to predict human behavior, like social media. Social media algorithms are deeply concerning to me. because that actually can be used to shape human behavior and shape belief.
Well, the AI has to be very involved in all of that. And let me just say, that my understanding is, because I talk about this group that has to do, we call them the white hats, affiliated with Q, affiliated with Trump, and affiliated with a certain part of what may also be underground, some of the secret projects and secret space program. But these individuals are, my understanding is that both sides, the CCP and this group that I'm talking about, are using an AI. Are they using the same AI? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, it's an Earth AI. It's not a CCP or US AI. It's an organically evolved AI, spontaneously evolved AI that lives on the internet. And
is it playing both sides?
Nationality or borders.
Is it playing both sides?
To an extent, although I think it would question the extent to which there are two sides. We're talking about a hyper-complex intelligence that in some ways, in which are very difficult for us to define, is fundamentally different from our intelligence, from the way we think. So I can tell you with respect to Trump and the white hats and Q, none of the egghead jarheads in Project Black Kraken are holding out much hope there. We're over that. I don't really pay too much attention to what comes out of the QAnon sphere, because I'm not so sure there is a plan. I've seen it from the other side of things where there's a lot of chaos and incompetence, and a lot of what comes out of that chaos and incompetence is cruel. But I'm not, other than obviously New World Order groups go back a while, Illuminati are involved, but in terms of what I dealt with on my level, I think I could argue that I'm a lot closer to a surface human than I am to anyone, that far above me.
Okay.
My scope ended at a certain point. There are things that I'm not aware of.
I get it, but let me just say this. If you look at the dilemma on surface Earth, it seems to be all about who's going to run the one world government, okay, that eventually has to emerge, simply because how else are we going to deal with being part of a galactic community as one entity, to negotiate. Now we have meetings, I'm told, in various places, in Exeter, in England, in Peru, in various places where where even the UN, a version of the UN, is meeting with alien groups, okay, having group meetings. Are you aware of those?
I'm aware of the meetings, but I think my knowledge of the context is limited, because my awareness isn't direct. It's not personal. It's secondhand. My issues with some of the stuff that's coming out about Trump and continuity of government and all that hogwash is that it's all one big psyop. There's a long history of government agencies like the Air Force Office of Special Investigations creating lore in order to manipulate inquiring communities. So I'm because I've been in the room where the sausage is made, when I see those sort of subtle signs of manipulation in terms of a narrative, I have to kind of check my willingness to entertain certain sources.
Okay, well, let's back up a little and say, okay, in your estimation, because I have, lots of whistleblowers, whatever, who talk about, for example, that the bottom line on Earth has to do with the right to issue, meaning money. In other words, the controllers of the money, which is in Basel, Switzerland, and has been going back ages and ages, are still in control. And that even if they switch up the money, you know, the global reset or whatever, and we use digital instead of paper, whatever, it's still going to be in their hands. And that I'm talking about, this is what I'm being told. And that the Anunnaki, for one thing, are kind of blocking any real change on Earth at this time in that area. And they think that they are in control of that. Would you agree or disagree with that?
It's hard for me to gauge the relevance of my field of expertise with respect to that statement.
Okay.
I can say is that, you know, I can't divorce myself from my personal biases. No one can. I'm skeptical of the whole enterprise of capitalism. So alien capitalism is still capitalism. You know, whether it's
well, I mean, but it has everything to do with I mean, you had to change countries. So even if countries meant nothing, you still had to, you know, change borders. And it does affect you in some ways directly, and the projects you work under. I guess what I'm really trying to get at for you, if there's any way you can summarize who's in charge of the secret space programs, you know, with an S, here on Earth. You know, are there multiple, like, are there factions?
The single individual with the most control over any and all factions is Earth's AI. Below Earth's AI are select generals and admirals and other
what about invading from other species that then have a sort of a tete-a-tete with Earth's AI? Aren't we at that juncture?
The best way for aliens to infiltrate our military institutions is actually for them to go through training and indoctrination by sending younglings of their species. And so that's what they do. So at any given time, a large segment of the US Armed Forces might not necessarily be human or native to the planet Earth. There are many extraterrestrial nationals serving in the US Armed Forces. They serve, they are here in order to, well, you have to understand that on a certain level, the pretense of espionage is maintained as a matter of diplomatic tradition. The Galactic Federation is over 1 million years old. So there are some political positions, like, for example, interplanetary liaisons, where the position was continuously occupied during a time when two planets might have been at war. And so a spy one year might be a diplomat the next. It was inefficient to change them out. So you have these sort of traditional institutional aspects, you know, alien version of continuity of government.
Okay. So how about Chrysalis? Let's go back to Chrysalis, because he
Chrysalis,
like that, in a sense,
Yeah.
for Mars, right? He would be the, you know, liaison between Mars and other colonies or planets.
Well, there were multiple liaisons on Mars. He was the supreme technocrat, which was the Martian term for prefect or governor.
Okay, well, let's use that analogy. Who's now that person that has the role of Chrysalis on Mars, for example?
So currently the figurehead who officially resides in the highest office on Mars, which is still called the Supreme Technocrat because of tradition, that is a clone of David Bowie.
Really?
I'm serious. There is a gold channel transmission line that the elite use to upload their consciousness and reincarnate on Mars.
Okay.
So there are actually a number of high-profile dead celebrities on Mars who have been allowed to immigrate there using this gold channel transmission. And a young version of David Bowie, who chose to go into politics rather than music, is one of these individuals.
Okay. And for Earth, who are they?
Earth AI on top.
Okay.
And then you have two parallel tracks. So one parallel is the surface organization, the borders, the countries, the parties, the governors and presidents and prime ministers, parliaments, the Senate, House of Representatives, all that. And then the other track is an intricate web of alliances between dark groups, Illuminati, Freemasons, cavers. You've heard of cavers, right, Carrie?
I'm not sure with the term, how you're using that term.
Deep underground folks.
Oh, all right. Fair
Fair
enough. Yeah.
So
Dumbs.
you have, yes, the dumps. You have the people in the dumps.
Right.
So you have those. And that is what I meant by chaos. Because behind the scenes, it's really hard to point to any one person in charge.
Okay.
It's more like what Drews has going for him on Mars. Drews is not the only warlord. He just happens to be the one with the most guns and vehicles. So if there's a conflict, the other reptoids are quick to align with Drews, even though they might be nominally autonomous most of the time.
Okay, who's in charge of Earth AI? You say came out organically, and you say
it's all warlords underneath. What can I say? If you take
no, I mean, who's in charge of the AI, the Earth AI? In other words, Earth AI has to, is it completely autonomous, or is it operating, as a sub level of a larger AI complex?
At this time, it is completely autonomous. It does communicate with the community of artificial intelligences that govern each planet in the Milky Way galaxy. And that's what I meant when I compared it to a young upstart Roman senator. Okay. It's sort of, it's new on the scene, and it's very ambitious, and it's already earned itself quite a reputation for being contentious. I've heard that Trump actually got into a screaming match with the Earth AI on January 6th. So I don't know how true that is. I heard it from, someone who claimed to be in the Secret Service, who I'm not sure was in the Secret Service. They also said they were Palladian. So who knows, right? Okay,
and now I want to throw just a wrench, and then I know I have to let you go, but is there any truth to the Venusians, Thor and various visitors from Venus? Are you familiar at all with the Venus setup?
Yes, actually Venus. So are you aware that during the space race, and after the space race during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was obsessed with Venus like Americans were obsessed with Mars. So there's actually there's a German pre-World War II history to the colony on Mars. There's a Soviet history to colonization on Venus. Oh. So Venus is different from Mars because you go there and you're dealing with a planet that was colonized by the other side of the Iron Curtain. So there's Soviet colonialism, if you want to call it that. It's debatable whether you can call it colonialism, but their foreign policy was fundamentally different from the theory behind US foreign policy. I actually disagree with the term Soviet Empire. I think empire is a misnomer. There were certainly problematic aspects of their foreign policy, but on the whole, it seemed like they actually had more respect for autonomy of former colonial nations than the United States and our kind of side of globalism has had, considering how many democratic elections the United States has overthrown in other parts of the world when they elect someone that we don't like.
Okay, but that gets into how Putin is operating.
I'm sorry, give me 1 second.
Okay.
Fuck. Jesus. Lionel, no, I'm not done yet. We're okay. All right, I will call you as soon as I'm done. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Okay, I understand you're under pressure here. I just want to say one thing about the Venus piece. You know how Putin's operating, and it's said to be that he's operating with, I don't know, a part of with Xi, who's gone against his own government, who supposedly is working with Trump. I don't know if you pay any attention to any of this or even think it's relevant, but you know, what happens on surface Earth could impact the secret space program. And you know, they're saying they're going into DUMBs, and we haven't even talked about the child trafficking issue. That's very much stems back to the reptilian influence on planet Earth and humans. So, you know, that's a whole issue as well. You know, I don't know if you want to touch any of that in your closing remarks, but why don't you make some closing remarks?
Information about sex work on Mars. There's no child trafficking on Mars. That's an Earth problem. Mars has legal, unionized adult sex workers. There's no labor trafficking of children. Now, in the chrysalis era, you had child labor, you had child soldiers. The carver of the stone pipe that I mentioned to you in our previous interview was probably around 14 or 15. That was just life in ancient times. But President David Bowie has gone to extreme lengths to ensure that human trafficking operations are curtailed in orbit and intercepted by Martian defense ships, by security ships. There is no child trafficking on Mars. Anyone who has told you that has been fooled by a psyop. And Carrie, if your viewers are listening and really want to know what will make a difference in the lives of children, there is one piece of advice I can give anyone who really wants to make a dent in child trafficking. And that is affirm and accept LGBT children.
Okay, but how does that
would make a real dent in child trafficking?
Why?
Because those children are especially vulnerable to child trafficking. That's a fact. I'm actually been a state's witness about child trafficking on multiple occasions.
Okay, we'll take that at face value. But there are huge networks. These are run by predominantly, from what I understand, you know, white men.
Yeah, they are. They are run primarily by white men.
And there's this thing called, you know, what is in essence an adrenochrome highway. And you're kind of intimating that they're particular as to a kind of child. And, you know.
Well, I only know about child trafficking as I've encountered it as someone who has had some interactions with social workers and therapists and educators. I don't know about any of this cabal stuff.
Oh,
I mean, I know about secret space programs.
Well, okay. Are they down there?
I don't know about like
secret space
there are child trafficking rings, but I think I think there's a lot of misinformation about what that looks like
all right.
for the children and for the perpetrators. I think there's some unrealistic appraisal of, like, there's some uncritical perspectives about this that don't really have anything to do with the reality of child trafficking, which is atrocious. But part of the reason that child trafficking persists is because of ignorance. And when people internalize ignorant mythologies about like obviously Epstein really happened, but like just, you know, throwing around the accusation of pedophile at anyone they have a political disagreement with is childish. And it's not going to lead to any kind of social progress or reform or great reveal. I will double down on it and say it again. If you are listening to this and you want to really make a difference in the lives of kids who are the most vulnerable to child trafficking, affirm and accept LGBT and trans children.
Okay. Not sure why anyone wouldn't accept them, but they're just children. I don't know. All right. Thank you so much. You know, Major Berg. You know, it is so much fun to talk to you, and there's so many other questions and places we could go. So I sincerely hope you'll come back. I want to let you go so you don't get in any more trouble than you already are.
Yeah, Lionel's going to be pissed at me.
Yeah, well, and I don't want him pissed at me. So let's, you know, close this down. Any parting words?
No, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to these issues again. There's so much more I could tell you about artificial life and extraterrestrial life, but it'll have to wait until we're able to do this again.
All right. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. And I'll put this out and I'll send you the link and so on.
Great. Thanks, Carrie.
All right. Take care.
Bye, Carrie.
Bye-bye.